Hello, everybody. I wanted to see if Q is in the Bible. Q plus. I don't think Q plus is Donald Trump for the military. I think Q is the angels. Q plus is God. That's what I found. Found some pretty cool things. The Q source. The Q source, also called Q document, Q gospel, or Q from German, Q meaning source, is a hypothetical written collection of primarily Jesus' sayings. Q is part of the common material found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but not in the Gospels of Mark. According to this hypothesis, this material is drawn from the early church's oral tradition. Along with Markan priority, Q was hypothesized by the 1900s and is one of the foundations of most modern gospel scholarship. D.H. Streeter formulated a widely accepted view of Q, that it was written in Koine Greek, that most of its contents appear in Matthew, in Luke, or in both, and that Luke more often preserves the text's original order than Matthew. In the two-source hypothesis, the three-source hypothesis, and the Q plus hypothesis, Matthew and Luke both use Mark and Q as sources. Some scholars have postulated that Q is actually a plurality of sources, some written and some oral. Others have attempted to determine the stages in which Q is composed. Q's existence has been questioned, omitting what should have been a highly treasured dominical document from early church catalogs. Its lack of mention by the Jerome is a conundrum of modern biblical scholarship, but copying Q might have been seen as unnecessary, as it was preserved in the canonical Gospels. Hence it was preferable to copy the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, where the sayings of Jesus from Q were rephrased to avoid misunderstandings and to fit their own situations and their understanding of what Jesus had really meant. Despite challenges, the two-source hypothesis retains wide support. The two-source hypothesis, Mark and Q. The two-source hypothesis proposes that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written independently, each using Mark and a second hypothetical document called Q as a source. Q was conceived as the most likely explanation behind the common material, mostly sayings, found in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, but not in Mark. For centuries, biblical scholars followed the Augustinian hypothesis that the Gospel of Matthew was the first to be written. Mark used Matthew in the writings of his, and Luke followed both Matthew and Mark in his. The Gospel of John is quite different from the other three, which because of their similarity are called the Synoptic Gospels. 19th century New Testament scholars who rejected Matthew's priority in favor of Markan priority speculated that Matthew's and Luke's authors drew the material they have in common with the Gospel of Mark from Mark's Gospel. But Matthew and Luke also share large sections of text not found in Mark. They suggested that neither Gospel drew upon the other, but upon a second common source termed Q. Herbert Marsh, an Englishman, is seen by some as the first person to hypothesize the existence of a narrative source and a sayings source, although he included the latter parable unique to Matthew and unique to Luke. In his 1801 work, a dissertation on the origin and composition of our three first canonical Gospels, he used the Hebrew letter Aleph to denote the narrative source and the letter Beth to denote the saying source. The next person to advance the sayings hypothesis was the German Friedrich Schumacher. In 1832, Schumacher interpreted an enigmatic statement by the early Christian writer Papatus and Herophilus. Matthew compiled the oracles of the Lord in Hebrew manner of speech, and everyone translated them as well he could, as evidence of a separate source rather than the traditional interpretation that Papatus was referring to the writings of Matthew in Hebrew. Schumacher proposed that Papatus was actually referring to a sayings collection of the Apostle Matthew that was later used, together with the narrative elements, by another Matthew and by other evangelists. In 1838, another German Christian, Hermann Wise, took Schumacher's suggestion of a saying source and combined it with the idea of Markan priority to formulate what is now called the two-source hypothesis, in which both Matthew and Luke use Mark and the saying source. Henrik Julius Holtzmann endorsed this approach in an influential treatment of the symptotic problem in 1863, and the two-source hypothesis was dominated ever since. At this time, the second source was usually called the Logia, or Luwian will. Because of Papatus' statement, Holtzmann gave it the symbol lambda, but toward the end of the 19th century, doubts began to grow about the propriety of anchoring his existence to Papatus' account. So the symbol Q was devised by Jonas Pius to denote Q, meaning source, was adopted to remain neutral about the connection of Papatus to the collection of sayings. This two-source hypothesis speculates that Matthew borrowed from both Mark and Q. For most scholars, Q accounts for what Matthew and Luke share, sometimes in exactly the same words, but that are absent in Mark. Examples are the devil's three temptations of Jesus, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and many individual sayings. In the four Gospels, a study of origins, Burnett Hillman Streeter argued that a third hypothetical source referred to as M lies behind the material in Matthew that has no parallel in Mark or Luke, and that some material present only in Luke might have come from an also unknown L source. This hypothesis posits that underlying the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are at least four sources, namely the Gospel of Mark, the three lost texts, Q, M, and L. M material is represented by green in the above chart, and L by blue. Throughout the remainder of the 20th century, there were various challenges and refinements of Streeter's hypothesis. For example, in his 1953 book, The Gospel Before Mark, Pearson Parker postulated an early version of Matthew, Aramaic M or Proto-Matthew, as a primary source. Parker argued that it was not possible to separate Streeter's M material from the material Matthew parallel to Mark. In the early 20th century, more than a dozen reconstructions of Q were made, but these reconstructions differed so much from each other that not a single verse of Matthew was present in all of them. As a result, interest in Q subsided and it was neglected for many decades. This state of affairs changed in 1960 after translations of a newly discovered analogous saying collection, the Gospel of Thomas, became available. James M. Robinson of the Jesus Seminar and Helmut Koester proposed that collections of sayings such as Q and Gospel of Thomas represented the earliest Christian materials at an early point in a trajectory that eventually resulted in the canonical gospel. This burst of interest after the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas led to increasingly more sophisticated literary reconstructions of Q. Redactional speculation, notably in the work of John S. Kloppenborg, analyzing certain literary and thematic phenomena, argued that Q was composed in 3 stages. In his view, the earliest stage was a collection of wisdom sayings involving such issues as poverty and discipleship. Then he posits this collection was expanded by including a layer of judgmental sayings directed against this generation. The final stage included the temptation of Jesus narrative. Although Kloppenborg cautioned against assuming that Q's composition history is the same as the history of the Jesus tradition, the oldest layer of Q is necessarily the oldest and pure layer of Jesus tradition. Some recent seekers of the historical Jesus, including members of the Jesus Seminar, have done just that, basing their reconstructions primarily on the Gospel of Thomas and the oldest layer of Q. They propose that Jesus functioned as a wisdom sage rather than a Jewish rabbi, though not all members affirm the two source hypothesis. Kloppenborg is now a fellow of the Jesus Seminar himself. But scholars supporting the 3-stage Q development hypothesis, such as Burton L. Mack, argue that Q's unity comes not only from its being shared by Matthew and Luke, but also because in layers of Q, as reconstructed, the later layers build upon and presuppose the early ones, whereas the reverse is not the case. So evidence that Q has been revised is not evidence for this unity in Q, since the hypothesized revisions depend upon asymmetric logical connections between what are posited to be the later and early layers. Some biblical scholars believe that an unknown redactor composed the Greek language proto-gospel. It may have been circulating in written form about the time the Synoptic Gospels were composed, between the late 1850s and mid-90s AD. The name Q was coined by the German theologian and biblical scholar known as Wise. Synoptic Gospels and the nature of Q. The relationship among the 3 synoptic, I apologize, not very good pronouncing, Gospel goes beyond merely similarity in viewpoint. The Gospels often recount the same story, usually in the same order, sometimes using the same word. Scholars note that the similarities between Mark, Matthew, and Luke are too great to be coincidental. If the two-source hypothesis is correct, then Q would probably have been a written document. The Q with shared oral tradition is unlikely that it could account for the nearly identical word-for-word similarities between Matthew and Luke encoding Q material. Similarly, it is possible to deduce that Q was written in Greek. If the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were referring to a document that had been written in some other language, Aramaic for example, it is highly unlikely that two independent translations would have exactly the same wording. The Q document must have been composed for Matthew and Luke. Some scholars even suggest that Q predated Mark. A date for the final Q document is often placed in the 40s or 50s of the first century, with some arguing its so-called Cyphenchial layer. One Q containing 6 wisdom speeches is written as early as the 30s. If Q existed, it has since been lost. Some scholars believe it can be partially reconstructed by examining elements common to Matthew and Luke, but absent from Mark. This reconstructed Q does not describe the events of Jesus' life. Q does not mention Jesus' birth, his selection of the 12 disciples, his crucifixion, or the resurrection. Instead, it appears to be a collection of Jesus' sayings and quotations. Case for Q. The case for Q's existence follows from the argument that neither Matthew nor Luke is directly dependent on the other in the double tradition defined by New Testament scholars as material that Matthew and Luke share. That does not appear in Mark, but the verbal agreement between Matthew and Luke is so close in some parts of the double tradition that the most reasonable explanation for this agreement is common dependence on a written source or sources. Even if Matthew and Luke are independent, the Q hypothesis states that they use a common document. Arguments for Q being a written document include sometimes the exactness in wording is striking. For example, Matthew 6:24, Luke 16:13, 27:28, Greek words respectively. Matthew 7:7-8, Luke 11:9-10, 24 Greek words each. There's some commonality in order between the two. For example, the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount. The presence of doublets, where Matthew and Luke sometimes each present two versions of a similar saying but in different contexts. Only one of those versions appeared in Mark. Doublets may be considered a sign of two written sources. Mark and Q. Luke mentions that he knows of other written sources of Jesus' life, and that he has investigated in order to gather the most information. The fact that no Q manuscripts exist today does not necessarily argue against its existence. Many early Christian texts no longer exist, and we only know they did from their citation or mention in surviving texts. Once Q's text was incorporated into the body of Matthew and Luke, it was no longer necessary to preserve it, such as interest in copying Mark seems to have waned substantially once it was incorporated into Matthew. The editorial board of the International Q Project writes, during the 2nd century when the canonizing process was taking place, scribes did not make new copies of Q, since the canonizing process involved choosing what should and what should not be used in the church service. Hence, they preferred to make copies of the Gospel of Mark and Luke, where the sayings of Jesus from Q were rephrased to avoid misunderstanding and to fit their own situations and their understanding of what Jesus had really meant. Case for Q against Q. Case against Q. While the two-source hypothesis remained the most popular explanation for the Synoptic Gospel's origins, the existence of the minor agreements has raised serious concern. These minor agreements are those points where Matthew and Luke agree against or beyond Mark precisely within the Markan verses. For example, the mocking question at the beating of Jesus, "Who is it that struck you?" Luke 22-64, Matthew 26-68, found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Although this minor agreement falls outside the usual except range of Q, the minor agreement call into question the proposition that Matthew and Luke knew Mark, and not each other. Luke might have indeed been following Matthew, or at least a Matthew-like source. Peabody and Nickel argue that until a reasonable explanation is found, the two-source hypothesis is not viable. Secondly, how could a major and respected source used in two canonical Gospels disappear? If Q did exist, it would have been highly treasured in the early church. It remains a mystery how such an important document, which was the foundation for two canonical Gospels, could be lost. An even greater mystery is why the extensive church catalog compiled by Eusebius and Nicephorus would omit such an important work, yet include such non-canonical accounts as the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas. The existence of a treasured sayings document in circulation going unmentioned by the early church fathers remains one of the great conundrums of modern biblical scholarship. Pierre Franco Patrice argues that until these issues are resolved, Q will remain in doubt. Some scholars argue that the Gospel according to the Hebrews was the basis for the Synoptic tradition. They point out that in the first section of Dives Jerome, we find the Gospel of Mark where it should be as it was the first Gospel written and was used as a source for the later Gospels. Following it should be Q, but not only is Q not where it should be at the top of Jerome's list, this treasured work recording the Logia of Christ is mentioned nowhere in Jerome. Rather, the first seminal document is not Q, but the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Austin Farrer, Michael Goder, and Mark Goodacre have also argued against Q, maintaining Markan priority, claiming the use of Matthew by Luke. This view has come to be known as the Farrer hypothesis. Their arguments include Farrer, in his 1955 paper that first outlined his hypothesis, notes that when we find two documents that contain common material, identical in the words and phrases they use to describe some scenes, the simplest explanation is that one of the two used the other as a source, rather than both using a third document as a source. Golder points to common Matthean phrases such as "rod of vipers," "make fruit," and "cast into the fire," that each appear in Luke only once, in a Q passage. Golder's conclusion, based on writing styles, is that Matthew is the source for these Q sayings. Goodacre notes that there is no extant copy of Q, and no early church writer makes an ambiguous reference to a document resembling the Q that modern scholars have reconstructed from the common material in Luke and Matthew. While supporters say that the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas supports the concept of a sayings gospel, Mark Goodacre points out that Q has a narrative structure as reconstructed and is not simply a list of sayings. Other scholars have brought other arguments against Q, two documents, both correcting Mark's language, adding birth narratives and a resurrection apology, and adding a large amount of sayings material are likely to resemble each other, rather than to have such similar scope by coincidence. Oh, coincidence. That's what Q said. Nothing is a coincidence. Specifically, there are 347 instances by Nirennick's count where one or more words are added to the Markan text in both Matthew and Luke. These are called the minor arguments against Mark. Some 198 instances involve one word, 82 involve two words, 35 3, 16 4, and 16 instances involve five or more words in the extant text of Matthew and Luke as compared to the Markan passages. John Wyndham adhered to the Augustinian hypothesis that Matthew was the first gospel, Mark the second, and Luke the third, and objected on the similar grounds to those who hold to the Reisbach hypothesis. Edwin Lindman, formerly a follower of Rudolf Bultmann, rejected Q and Markan priority for a variation of the two gospels hypothesis that holds that the Mosaic requirement for two witnesses made two Jewish gospels a necessity in the diaspora audience. F. David Farnell's work, The Jesus Crisis, The Inroads of Historical Criticism into Evangelical Scholarship. Some of the more notable portions of the New Testament are believed to have been first recorded in Q. The Beatitude, love your enemies, golden rule, judge not, lest ye be judged, the test of a good person, the parable of the wise and the foolish builders, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the wedding feast, the parable of the talents, the parable of the leaven, the parable of the blind leading the blind, the Lord's Prayer, expounding of the law, the birds of heaven, and the lilies in the field. Text and online resources from the Los Angeles Gospel of Q, International's Q Project, New Testament Gateway, Q Web Materials. Ask a scholar. Q says, how many scholars believe that Q existed as a source for Matthew and Luke? Many scholars accept the existence of Q as a source for Matthew and Luke. It is a fundamental aspect of the two-source theory, according to which Matthew and Luke independently use both Mark and the hypothetical source Q. Two-source theory is given as the primary solution to this Sodic problem in most of the introductory textbooks. It is assumed in many of the commentaries, monographs, and articles written about the Gospel. However, there have always been detractors, including some who dispute both tenets of the two-source theory, Markan priority and Q, arguing instead that Matthew was the first Gospel, that Luke used Matthew, and that Mark used Matthew and Luke. The two Gospel or Reisbach theory, and others who maintain Markan priority, but dispense with Q by proposing that Luke also knew Matthew. The Sorrow theory. It is perhaps safe to say that while Q remains popular among New Testament scholars, there is a significant number of scholars who are unconvinced about the existence of the hypothetical document Q. The you are interested in further reading, I'd recommend these two introductory books. John Kloppenberger, Q, The Earliest Gospel. I told you I knew Q. It's biblical. That's why they know, that's why they hit everything so dead on. That's why by the minute, by the time. An introduction to the original stories and sayings of Jesus and the Prophetic Problem, A Way Through the Maze by Mark Goodacre. What is the Q source? A general assumption among sources critics that Mark was the first written gospel. This is seen by an analysis of Matthew and Luke. Both Matthew and Luke have material in their gospel that is common to the Gospel of Mark. At the same time, there is common material found in Luke and in Matthew that is not found in Mark. The scholars then try to account for this common information found in these two Gospels that is absent from Mark's Gospel. The working hypothesis is that Matthew and Luke, in addition to having Mark as a source for their information, had a second independent source that Mark did not use. This second independent source is called simply the Q source. That letter, Q, is used since it is the first letter of the German word Quell, which is simply the word for source. That is a source, the information source. That is to say, the Q source is a source that is unknown to us but known to the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke. Much of this analysis is speculative and hypothetical. Scholars differ as to whether the alleged Q source was written source shared by Matthew and Luke or simply an oral tradition they both had access to. Wherever we land in our conclusion about the method by which the Gospel writers compiled their text, and the very analysis that we have seen gives us one clear benefit by isolating material that is found in Matthew and only in Matthew, or isolating material that is found in Luke and only Luke, or isolating material found in Mark and only Mark. We get clues as to the audience to which the author was directing this information and also his major themes in the particular gospel. For example, in looking at the Gospel of Matthew, we find more citations and allusions to the Old Testament scriptures than in any of the other Gospels. This fact alone lends credence to the idea that Matthew has directed his Gospel primarily to a Jewish audience to show how Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah, fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. See that, guys? I knew it. I knew I had a feeling, man. That's why I started looking for it. I looked for it. And I knew it. I knew Q is biblical. How can it be in the Bible, right? How can it be? Unless Q was helping Mark and them. Mark and Matthew. Luke and Matthew. To write the books. To awaken the people. Just like Q is doing now. It's all biblical. That's why they hit everything with such precision. Has to be. Well, I think it is. You guys have a great night. Just thought I'd share this with you. I'd be with you, nigga.